Lots of theatrics at Westminster at the moment, but the bigger story is that after the 2007-2008 financial crisis and everything that has followed during 14 years of Conservative rule, much of Britain has tuned out completely about British politics, is deeply cynical about whether government can actually ever change their lives and make anything any better, and the big story is what Labour's going to do about it. Rarely has the gap between Westminster politics and the mood of the rest of the country seemed bigger. In the Commons, throbbing over excitement about Tory defections, good idea, bad idea, the outrage, the theatre, all of that. And in the country, a mood of quiet despair about the ability of any government to actually improve daily life. Around the country, there is the same old, weary scepticism about all politicians, the lot of them. And I think despair and cynicism about politics is the big, as it were, mood difference, the atmospheric pressure which divides today from the mid-1990s when New Labour was on the edge of power. Back then we'd had Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and the country was a bit sick of all of that. But there was a mood of kind of bouncy optimism and hope about the future, which is the very reverse of where we are today. Now, that is not a difficult thing to explain. Since then, we've had the crash of 2008. We've had austerity, we've had the endless, wearisome and divisive arguments over Brexit, we've had Truss, we've had the inflation driven by the Ukraine war, we've had the endless Tory leadership wars, on and on and on it has gone. And the result is the public have really given up, not just on one party or another, but on politics. 5 years after Boris Johnson promised to repay the trust of the British people, polling by YouGov for Sky News has found that the number of people who almost never trust the British government to put the needs of the country ahead of the needs of their own party has almost doubled from 26% to 49%. But if you think this cynicism is a Conservative-only problem, I suggest you think again, because the same polling found that 40% of us think there is little difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, and a piffling 12% of us think there is a great deal of difference between the parties. Now, I think all of this kind of gestures to the underlying problem with the Natalie Elphicke defection, because yes, it does cause perhaps some pro-Brexit, anti-immigrant voters to look again at Keir Starmer's Labour Party and think, do you know what, I could vote for them, and that might be electorally significant, particularly in the English South. But it also, at the same time, turbocharges this sense that they're all the same kind of cynical Westminster crowd swapping from one side to the other, and that's very dangerous. And by the way, it also tarnishes Keir Starmer's own personal brand as somebody of decency who is, unlike the rest of them, is going to bring a fresh tone to British politics. That's a big danger. But that was, of course, a Westminster story, and the much bigger story of the broken relationship between central government and the British electorate continues. And it seems to me that this May we are kind of stuck. British politics is stuck in a kind of listless no man's land with a kind of decaying, sickly smell in the air. We know what's going to happen, and the Conservatives are trudging grimly towards the electoral abattoir in the autumn. So we have this kind of stuck, waiting for it period for several months ahead, and this gives the Labour Party a fantastic opportunity. I was talking to David Miliband, now in New York, of course, at one point talked about as a future Labour leader, and he told me that he thought this period was what he called a precious moment for Labour, a period where the Labour Party can really think again, look hard at its policies, think about government ahead and avoid mistakes ahead, and he hoped they weren't going to waste it, and I don't think they are going to waste it. Right now, Keir Starmer is sitting down with his team who are asking him to imagine, looking back from the vantage point of 2028 at that first Labour-Starmer government, has it answered the disillusion and the scepticism of voters who feel left down? How much change has it made? And a lot of the internal papers insist that it isn't just that voters feel they've been left down, voters have been left down. So, in short, how can Labour do things differently? Mark Steers, the political scientist who directs the UCL Policy Lab, puts it, I think, very well when he says that the important thing a future Labour government must do is to change the way it works so that, and I quote, it is more respectful of people and the places where they live. Now, the big think tanks, whether it's the UCL Policy Lab, whether it's Labour Together or the Resolution Foundation or the IPPR, they're all in competition, of course, from Keir Starmer and his team. But interestingly, I think at the moment they are all effectively moving in the same direction, concentrating on the problem of delivery and that lethal gap between the rhetoric of a government and what it actually does. Now, straightforwardly, one of the answers must simply be more devolution, building on the achievements of the Blair and Brown governments and one of the few achievements of the Tory years as well. Because we have seen from Manchester to Liverpool to London or the West Midlands just how much energy and imagination and radicalism can be uncorked by local leadership far away from Westminster. And this is what Starmer promised at the beginning of this year in his Take Back Control Bill speech.
We will spread control out of Westminster, devolve new powers over employment support, transport, energy, climate change, housing, culture, childcare provision and how councils run their finances. And we'll give communities a new right to request powers which go beyond even that.
But increasing respect for voters and improving delivery must start with Whitehall. That's where the big money is. That's where the biggest power still resides. And there's been a very interesting conference run by the UCL Policy Lab under the title of Britain Renewed, How a Government That Respects Everyone Could Change Our Country. And it's going to focus in part on how to avoid calamities in the past, like the post office scandal, the Horizon scandal inside the post office, or the infected blood scandal. And indeed, right across the Western democracies, there have been so many scandals of delivery and unfairness and injustice caused by the propensity of central government to think about what the computer tells them, and the central numbers are not really listened properly to what ordinary voters and particular groups and communities are trying to say. But this agenda moves beyond trying to avoid screw-ups to what Starmer himself describes as a wholly new model of government intended to deliver his missions. Now, as a journalist, I have a certain suspicion of woolly, abstract thinking about revitalising or retooling or remaking government. We hear so much of it and so little actually happens in the real world. That's my experience anyway. And so it was really interesting to talk to somebody called Tara McGuinness, who was one of the people leading the Biden administration's transitional programme, and she's worked not only in the White House as a senior advisor to Biden, but also at the Office of Management and Budget on this agenda, and she is speaking at the East London conference to Labour Party directly. Now, the crucial thing, she argues, is that the social democratic governments around the world have to stop thinking fundamentally about themselves, the internal silos and hierarchies, the polling, the status, and all of that in the centre of government, and start to put themselves properly in the shoes of ordinary voters wherever they may be. Now, that was the subject of a Biden presidential order. But what in practice does it actually mean? So McGuinness cites, for instance, a new direct file online tax system, which makes negotiating the famously ferociously difficult IRS American tax system much easier for ordinary taxpayers. She talks about delivering help for low-income couples who want to start a family and are trying to work their way through the benefit system on food, on childcare, and on much else. She talks about extra help for older people in their 60s, trying to work out what's the best time to retire in terms of their pension, another real problem for ordinary people, and something that the Biden administration is trying to deliver in a much clearer and more effective way. Now, those are American examples, but Britain has its own tradition of really radical thinking around a more human and effective delivery, for instance, of welfare. Hilary Cottam, who's the author of Radical Help, is a key thinker, and I've talked to lots of shadow ministers who know that book and are thinking hard about it. And she has worked, for instance, on much more effective help for British adolescents. And I think in a British context, this agenda means things, for instance, like in terms of NHS reform, thinking less about internal structure of the NHS at the centre and big hospitals and all of that stuff, and much more about the problems of individual people trying to get a GP appointment. And I know Wes Streeting has again been thinking about this agenda and thinking about Hilary Cottam's work on that. So there is an awful lot of thinking going on. In a way, the biggest shift is a kind of abstract one. It's a flip in thinking, by civil servants and by ministers at the centre, not thinking about themselves and their own status and power structures, but thinking far, far harder the whole time about delivery, particularly for poorer and lower income families. But to make Whitehall behave differently is a hugely complex task, and it's something that Sue Gray, who's Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, and Peter Hyman, in charge of the policy mission delivery, are working on very, very hard with other people right now. And they have at least some rather good models of more effective decision-making by Whitehall to look back on. And I'm thinking of the Rough Sleepers Initiative of the 1990s. I'm thinking of the Social Exclusion Task Force, which ran from about 1997 to 2010. And of course, I'm also thinking of Kate Bingham's very, very successful vaccine rollout initiative during the Johnson years. These are all examples of Whitehall breaking down its own barriers and allowing outside experts, whether they're people who understand the pharmaceutical industry or rough sleepers' lives or whatever it might be, to come right into the system and be there in multidisciplinary teams which are well led. This is a different way of working. Sounds abstract, but it is absolutely crucial. And if Labour wants to change the way government is seen, this is the kind of thing they're going to have to think very, very hard about and produce really clear plans on going ahead. Now, none of this is easy, and I'm very conscious that it sounds a bit abstract and a bit dry. But I would argue that it is far, far more important than the passing theatrical cartwheeling of glee and despair about another Tory defection. That is a kind of story which obsesses MPs, obsesses journalists like me, but is really not going to cut through to a country which is deeply, deeply, and I come back to this, deeply cynical about the entire political system. The hard job of making government work better will determine whether that Starmer government, looking back from 2028, can take pride in a period of genuine achievement and change in the lives of ordinary people in this country, or, if it fails, whether it is just another part of the endless cycle of disillusion and despair, not just about one party or the other, but about British democracy itself. Thank you for watching. I would really love to know what you think, so please, if you can, leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can get videos from the New Statesman as soon as they're released.